who's the biggest bright spot for the Blackhawks through 50 games of this season?
You got one, Tony? I'll let you have the floor first.
I mean, it's really easy to sit there and say Connor Bedard, but I'm going to go Peter Mrazek, guys. That's where I'm going. I've said this numerous times on this show. This is a guy that I wanted out of Chicago. This is a guy that I thought was, the tank goalie, right? And now he's been re-upped for another 2 seasons. He's kept the Blackhawks in a lot of games. I think the reason that they're in some of these games, even at this point with Connor Bedard out, is largely on the back of Peter Mrazek just playing out of his mind right now. He's been a huge bright spot for this team. So, I'm the goalie guy. I'll go with my guy, Peter.
Yeah, I certainly love that pick as well. And Johnny, I'm going to preface just like I did to you in the pre-show, right? It's easy to point at number 98 and say, well, of course he's been the biggest bright spot of this team because he ultimately has. But I think a guy that desperately needs to get some appreciation this year, an honorable mention that I will allow you to say, Johnny, because you and I were in agreement when we discussed this a little bit pre-show. But another guy that needs to get his flowers is the guy that's played all 50 games, and that's Jason Dickinson. I think just the role that he's taken on in this team, going from a guy that was, I think, largely looked at as a shutdown third line center coming into the season to becoming one of the biggest offensive bright spots of this team, and ultimately earning himself a 2-year extension, just as Peter Mrazek and Nick Foligno did. You got to be encouraged by the story. He's entering effectively the prime of his career. He's only 28 years old. I mean, he's not old by any stretch of imagination. And as notorious TBG says here, it's a well-deserved extension for Mr. Jason Dickinson. So I think he's been an incredible bright spot for this team this year. And Johnny, I think I'm in agreement with your bright spot as well, because I think that guy has been a real gem so far in the team this year.
Right. I feel like this is a common theme with all of us. We can go and say Connor Bedard won. I feel like that's just fairly obvious. And this show would be very boring if we just all echoed each other's sentiments and said Connor Bedard here. So I'm going to go with Alex Vlasic on the back end. He has undoubtedly been the Blackhawks' best defenseman. He's still extremely young. And this guy, he just deserves this praise for his shutdown defensive abilities. Man, when you go and look at some of his numbers, I got a little bit more on him later too, but the points don't jump off the page at you. But he's got 84 blocks. He's a +2, which is kind of insane to think about how much the Blackhawks get scored on and how little scoring they do. And then when you think about his profile and that he's not really an offensive, minded guy for the most part. I mean, he can move it pretty well, and he moves himself, his legs pretty well. However, it's not like he's dishing assists like a really offensive minded defenseman when you think of the top echelon of them in the league, and they just seem to rack up helpers on a night in, night out basis. He's still +2 on this team. That is, extremely impressive in my mind. And we've said it before, we'll say it again, plus minus isn't the end all be all. It's not the ultimate indicator of whatever. But when you take into consideration the external circumstances around him, given this team's struggles so far, his play has been very impressive and very poised for someone that young. And shout out to him, because I love, we talked about it before. You can't teach talent. You can't teach size either. The guy is just massive. He moves well for it, and he looks like Freddy Krueger with the extendo arms when he, lays out and blocks a pass or blocks a shot or whatever. So love me some Alex Vlasic.
Johnny, really quick on the plus minus stats here, giving some more love to Jason Dickinson. Jason Dickinson on this Blackhawks team at +8 this year, which feels just impressive. Absolutely absurd given the state of the team right now.
Right. Driving play. He's driving play. Yep. And then, Alex Vlasic is preventing other teams' best, scorers from really piling it on the Blackhawks. And I think that's something that you've seen. Sure, there are a few games that get out of hand, and we know the backup goalie situation behind Tony's bright spot and Peter Mrazek. We know Arvid Soderblom struggles. We know some of the depth defensemen there. That third pair is just kind of thrown together on a nightly basis, right? It's Louis Crevier in, it's Isaac Phillips in, it's Nikita Zaitsev when he was healthy in there. So to go and look at some of those numbers for some of those guys, that's why they're bright spots here as we discuss them. So we'll move to the flip side of the coin, guys. And another one that you could probably give an obvious answer for, but we'll go round table again. Who's been the most disappointing Blackhawks player through 50 games of this season?
Johnny, do you want to go first? I feel like you never get to go first on these.
I'll go first.
Give him first.
I'll state the obvious. We didn't want to state the obvious for the biggest bright spot. I'll state the obvious. It's Lucas Reichel by far. And you know what? Maybe it's not all entirely his doing. Sure, a better performance night in, night out would help his confidence with his game, but B, the fan base's perception of him. Maybe it's partly on Kyle Davidson for all of the kind of hype up talk that he got early on in the season, and that he is an NHL ready player. He is going to move from wing to center, and we expect him to play second line center behind Connor Bedard this year. Well, that didn't pan out. He got moved down. We talked about his struggles in past shows here just as early as last week when we did it, and he was a healthy scratch for a couple games to start this road trip. He gets back into the lineup, and he did have a little bit of a breakaway chance and maybe flashed a little bit against Calgary on Saturday night. But once again, Blackhawks don't have any results to show for it. And when we're talking about that and people point to that and say, oh, well, Lucas Reichel looks like he's got a little bit of a stride back. It's a rare, okay game for him. Most nights it's just unnoticeable, and that's unacceptable for a former first-round pick who was touted this highly. Once again, maybe not entirely his fault, but with the expectations that were placed upon him and the words that were said about him, glowing words that were said about him early on in the season, by far, expectations versus performance, Lucas Reichel has been the most disappointing Blackhawks player so far.
Yeah, Johnny, I think you completely nailed it on the head here. Going to the comments section as well, Notorious TBG saying Corey Perry would have been his biggest disappointment, but he guesses it's kind of an incomplete grade in technicality, just given the foreseen circumstances. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of a fair way if you actually think about it, right? I mean, early on in the season, one of the top scorers on this team, and then everything goes down the way it did, and his contract is terminated. That certainly qualifies as a disappointing set of action. So I don't think that's a terrible answer by any means. Gentlemen, I'm going to go with a guy that last season was a 20-goal scorer, and he has just disappeared. Taylor Radish is my biggest disappointment this season, not named Lucas Reichel. He has 10 points in over 40 games played this season. To be exact, he has played 45 games this year. 10 points, 5 goals, 5 assists. And we all sat here, especially when the Brandon Hagel trade occurred. And yes, the 2 first-round picks were certainly the biggest pieces of that deal. I think we all knew that. But Taylor Radish came in as a former second-round draft pick, had a lot of offensive upside. We saw it a year ago when he was a 20-goal scorer. Never expected Taylor Radish to be a 70-point player. He's not that kind of player, right? He's the big power forward that your best season out of him is probably a 2020 season, kind of similar to what Andreas Athanasiou did a year ago. And Radish wasn't far off of that a year ago. 20 goals, 17 assists. I think that's a beautiful season for a player like Taylor Radish. This year, he has been non-existent. He's had elevation opportunities in the lineup. Those haven't worked out. He's played lower in the lineup. He's just vanished. He's not even making differences in games this year. And if you put a gun to my head, gentlemen, right now and told me which one of the 2 guys acquired from Tampa are you keeping going to next year, I think Boris Kachuk has had more of an impact on this team right now than Taylor Radish has. And we could all sit here and probably say that Radish was the bigger piece in that Hagel trade. I think Taylor Radish has been so disappointing to the fact that he has literally played himself out of a contract next season in Chicago. And I think Boris Kachuk has played himself into a potential contract next season to stay with the organization. That's how disappointed I am in number 11, Taylor Radish.
Right. You're probably looking at a lower value in terms of money, dollar wise for Boris Kachuk, but it's a fair point there when you once again consider expectations versus performance. So Tony, go ahead.
Absolutely.
I think we all know where this is going, but we have to do this. We absolutely have to. This isn't a guy that gets 1 thumbs down. He gets 2 thumbs down. 2 thumbs down. We're in the storm. Arvid Soderblom, 2-15, 873 save percentage, just abysmal. After we talk about how Peter Mrazek has kept this team in many games, Arvid Soderblom has been the Swiss cheese of the NHL in terms of goaltenders. That's why we've got a meme for it. I don't really need to go much farther than just say he's been absolutely terrible. That's why he's pretty much been stapled to the bench outside of back-to-backs from Luke Richardson here. It's just an easy decision to start Peter Mrazek over this guy. This was supposed to be a growth year, a year where he steps up and starts to make a name for himself, and he's pretty much shat the bed. So that is my biggest disappointment here from the Blackhawks in this season thus far.
Absolutely. And I want to just add on to that really quickly, just some observations from the last 3 games from between the last time we talked and today. From Arvid Soderblom's start, he got one because there was a back-to-back situation, right? So he got that Wednesday game at Seattle, and it was a 6-2 loss. And there were a couple people that were saying, well, why do you blame the goalie when the whole team can't, they can't score and the defense is shoddy in front of them and all of that? Well, when you go and look at moments in games, because hockey is a game of momentum, we know it swings back and forth like a pendulum here. The backbreaker was when Arvid Soderblom could not make the big stop on Thomas Tatar's breakaway right after Ryan Donato had a chance that was denied at the other end. Their goalie makes a save. Our goalie doesn't. We're absolutely defeated there. And then what does Arvid Soderblom turn around and do? He lets up one of the biggest rebounds that I've ever seen on a very basic shot that comes into his pads. Can't even smother it or get a paddle on it to get to the corner. And it comes right back out for an immediate shot that goes past him. And the Blackhawks' soul was absolutely crushed. But it was because of that save that he didn't make on the breakaway. And sure, once again, you go back to the defensemen. Well, they got all jumped up in the play and they couldn't, get back in a better defensive position that it works out better. Well, guess what? In the modern game of hockey, you're going to have rushes back and forth, and you're going to get sucked up into the play sometimes when you're trying to generate offense. And why do they have to try to generate offense? Because they're so injured and they have so many, guys that are primary scorers out. So then they were already down in the game because of Arvid Soderblom letting a couple of goals in. Once again, maybe not the first two completely his fault, but then you go and look at just that instance in the game, and it was absolutely the backbreaker. They said it on TNT. Eddie Olczyk talked about it. John Weideman, Troy Murray both discussed it on the radio, and I just can't see the defense for it there. So it's just piling onto yours, Tony. Arvid Soderblom, very disappointing.